The Case of Hannibal. Joe, the killer chef in New York City. In 2017, the Bronx, an ever-bustling part of New York City, became an epicenter of horror, as one of the most sinister and shocking cases in recent history came to light. What started as a routine trash pickup spiraled into a nightmarish revelation when a disturbed sanitation worker uncovered what would later be described by media outlets as the Bronx Butcher's blood-soaked legacy. The macabre discovery. It was a fall morning when a veteran sanitation worker, Mike Reynolds, made a routine stop in front of one of the city's highest-rated Michelin-starred restaurants, Euphoria. Bent over with a cigarette dangling from his lips, Mike was about to dump a heavy black garbage bag into his truck when its enormous weight and odd aroma made him suspicious. Smelled like pork, but worse, he would tell investigators later. Deciding to inspect the bag, Mike slashed it open with his trusty pocket knife. What tumbled out was a piece of what he thought was animal meat, until it revealed a slab of human skin, complete with faint tattoos that sent a chill down his spine. Horrified, he called the NYPD, marking the beginning of what would become one of the city's darkest investigations. The investigation begins. Detectives Dylan Hart and Maria Ruiz were the first responders to the scene. With years of experience in homicide, they knew this was no ordinary death. As Hart knelt near the garbage bags examining the contents with a gloved hand, he muttered, "This isn't just meat, this is someone's leg." Inside the bags, the NYPD uncovered more body parts. Arms, torso fragments, and what appeared to be facial tissue, meticulously skinned and oddly seasoned. Initial forensic analysis revealed that the corpses appeared to have been prepared with culinary precision. Knife cuts were clean and suggestive of a professional chef. Coupled with traces of oil and spices found on the remains, detectives feared what this meant. Someone was cooking humans. A trail leads to Hannibal. Joe detectives turned their focus to Euphoria, the Michelin-starred restaurant where the garbage bags were found. Its head chef, Joseph Gallagher, known affectionately as Hannibal Joe by his colleagues for his peculiar love of dark humor, immediately drew suspicion. Gallagher, a culinary genius and public figure in the food industry, had risen from a troubled upbringing in New Orleans to become a star chef in New York's cutthroat dining scene. His technique of fusing Creole cuisine with haute gastronomy had made him a sensation in the food world. However, behind the prestigious accolades and charming interviews, rumors swirled about Joe's abrasive demeanor, his minimalist social life, and his frequent fights with restaurant staff. He was brilliant, but something about him, it was like he thrived on chaos, said a sous chef who later cooperated with authorities. When police examined Euphoria, they found Gallagher's private freezer locked. After obtaining a warrant, what they discovered inside changed everything. Hidden among stacks of gourmet Wagyu beef and saffron-infused sauces were vacuum-sealed human remains. Each body part was labeled in culinary terms: short rib, shank, fillet. There were also handwritten recipe notes scattered across the countertops. One eerily detailed instruction read, "Leg loin marinated in rosemary and paprika roast at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 25 minutes. The killer's obsession. As detectives dove deeper, they uncovered a chilling background for Joe Gallagher. Raised in a broken home, Joe's father was an abusive alcoholic who often hunted wild animals as a twisted form of hobby. Joe honed his knife skills as a child but often practiced on roadkill. Teachers described young Joe as exceptionally gifted but deeply disturbed. He was expelled from culinary school in Louisiana for animal cruelty, after attempting to serve a dish made from stray cats. What struck investigators most was Joe's diary, found in his small apartment above the restaurant. Filled with increasingly erratic handwriting, it offered a glimpse into his psyche. He wrote, "Humans are no different from livestock. Society refuses to see the value in true artisanal butchery, so I will show them." Even more terrifying were the entries listing the names and profiles of missing staff members and customers from Euphoria. Unbeknownst to anyone, Joe had been preying on vulnerable employees, particularly undocumented workers and drifters he hired for short-term stints in the kitchen. The uprising in court. The trial of Hannibal Joe became a media circus. Courtroom seats were packed as former staff described Joe's manipulation tactics. "He made us call him Chef God. We thought it was just his ego. Turns out he truly believed it," one line cook testified. Joe, representing himself in court, appeared emotionless and meticulously clean-shaven, wearing a tailored black suit instead of his blood-stained chef's outfit. When asked by the prosecutor about his motivations, Joe simply smirked and replied, "A chef's duty is to create unforgettable dining experiences. The only way to transcend mediocrity is to embrace the extremes of nature itself. The legacy of fear. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours, unanimously convicting Joe on multiple counts of murder, torture, and desecration of corpses. In 2020, Joseph Gallagher was executed via lethal injection, but his story continues to haunt the nation. The restaurant where he honed his gruesome craft now stands abandoned, with urban legends claiming it's cursed. Journalists argued that Joe highlighted society's twisted fascination with true crime and glamorizing the culinary arts. The case sparked debates about the dangers of idolizing individuals solely based on their talents, ignoring the red flags in their personal lives. As the infamous phrase coined by one NYPD detective went, "Hannibal Lecter may be fiction, but Hannibal Joe was all too real." The Broken Sparrow of Montana. In 2009, amidst the vast, desolate landscape of rural Montana, an eerie and tragic mystery emerged that would haunt the tranquil village of Blackthorn for years to come. What started as a missing person case soon spiraled into one of the most harrowing tales of obsession, unrequited love, and violence in modern Montana history. The locals would come to call it the Broken Sparrow, a haunting nod to the victim, Lucy Taylor, a beloved elementary school teacher whose passion for birds was as boundless as the blue Montana sky. The disappearance. Montana's sprawling wilderness is both beautiful and unforgiving, a fact Lucy Taylor, 34, knew all too well. A dedicated teacher and nature lover, Lucy often spent her weekends hiking, birdwatching, and volunteering for wildlife conservation causes. Her days were typically spent teaching local children about math, science, and protecting the delicate ecosystem they shared with the wild. It was a late November afternoon when Lucy's routine abruptly changed. She never showed up for school on a crisp Monday morning, and when her colleagues called her phone, it went straight to voicemail. Her aging Chevy sedan was later discovered abandoned on a dirt trail leading deep into the forest, windshield dusty, passenger door slightly open, and her neatly folded coat still resting in the back seat. Oddly, her birdwatching journal and binoculars were also missing from the car. Montana locals are used to neighbors going quiet every now and then, especially during hunting or hiking season. But Lucy wasn't someone who went off the radar without telling people. Her vanishing triggered unease, and by the end of the first day, concerned parents and colleagues reported her disappearance to authorities. Sheriff Royce Marshall, a grizzled lawman nearing retirement, initially believed Lucy had likely wandered too far into the woods and gotten lost. Search teams were dispatched, volunteers scoured hiking trails, and even seasoned hunters lent their tracking expertise to no avail. Instead of answers, the search yielded only more questions. Near her car, volunteers found a small metal bird cage, rusty and half-buried beneath a pile of branches. On closer inspection, a faint streak of blood stained the inside of the cage's wires. It was the first ominous sign that this was more than a simple case of someone wandering too far from home. A body in the cabin. For weeks, Lucy's disappearance weighed heavily on the tiny community of Blackthorn. Her former students left drawings of birds pinned to her classroom door, and neighbors kept vigil outside her house. But the rural stillness broke dramatically on a snowy December morning, when 2 hunters stumbled on an abandoned cabin deep within the wooded outskirts of the village. Smoke no longer curled from the chimney, and snow had piled onto the roof. But when the men approached, their hunting dog barked furiously, refusing to enter. What they found inside would remain with them forever. Lying on the basement floor was Lucy Taylor, or what remained of her. Her body was found in pieces, meticulously dismembered and positioned around the room like some horrifying tableau. Old bird feathers were scattered around the floor. Written in smudged, frantic handwriting on the walls were the words, "She belonged to me, now she belongs to no one." Within hours, Sheriff Royce and his team cordoned off the cabin. The autopsy would later reveal that Lucy's death had been brutal. Defensive wounds on her arms indicated that she had fought desperately against her attacker before succumbing. Blood analysis showed high levels of sedatives, suggesting she had been incapacitated before the final act. Most chilling, though, were the post-mortem wounds and the methodical nature of the dismemberment, suggesting a killer both calculated and deeply disturbed. An obsessive killer emerges. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered disturbing details about Lucy's life. Her co-workers described her as kind, quiet, and deeply passionate about teaching. Parents adored her, students admired her, but not everyone viewed her that way. Whispers began to circulate about Donald Evans, a reclusive young man in his early 20s, who had once been one of Lucy's students a decade prior. Donald was, by most accounts, troubled even as a child. A loner with a deadened stare, he had grown up in an unstable household riddled with neglect. He frequently acted out in school, and by the time he joined Lucy's class in the 5th grade, he had already developed a reputation for being strange and unapproachable. But Lucy saw potential in Donald. She treated him differently from the other teachers, encouraging him to embrace his talent for drawing and showing unshakable patience when others might have given up. Years later, Donald would tell detectives, "She was the only one who ever cared about me." But that attention, however well-intentioned, planted the seeds of obsession. While Lucy moved on with her life, Donald clung to her memory. By the time he turned 20, his fascination with his former teacher had become warped. He began showing up near her school, watching her from afar, leaving crude sketches of birds on her windshield. Sketches eerily similar to the ones he had drawn as a child in her class. The townsfolk dismissed Donald as harmless and odd, but they couldn't have known the darkness brewing beneath the surface. Donald's fixation escalated into outright delusion, and in his deteriorating mental state, his love for Lucy twisted into a poisonous rage. The night it all unraveled. On the night of her disappearance, Lucy had been returning from a nature reserve where she'd been observing sparrows for her research. Investigators pieced together Donald's movements through GPS tracking on his battered old truck. He had driven to the reserve and waited for Lucy in the dark, armed with chloroform and a blade. Security footage from a nearby gas station showed Donald intently staring at Lucy as she filled her car up the previous day, not the first time he had trailed her movements. Donald confronted Lucy as she approached her car on that lonely dirt road. She resisted, shouting for help, but there were no ears to hear her. He overpowered her, binding her hands and forcing her into his truck before disappearing into the vast wilderness with her. He drove to the abandoned cabin, the grim stage for his unthinkable act. Justice for Lucy Donald Evans was arrested in his family's barn, where he was found carving crude bird ornaments from pieces of driftwood. When questioned, he confessed to everything with an unsettling calmness. "She was my sparrow, and I couldn't let her fly away," he said, a chilling metaphor that would headline newspapers across the nation. The trial gripped not just Montana, but the entire country. Mental health advocates debated whether Donald's tragic upbringing and untreated psychosis could justify leniency, but much of the public demanded retribution. After days of emotionally charged testimony, including heart-wrenching statements from Lucy's family, Donald was convicted of first-degree murder and given life without parole. The abandoned cabin was burned down shortly after the trial, but Blackthorn would never quite heal. Lucy's students, once children sketching birds in her class, are adults now, many still carrying the weight of what happened to their beloved teacher. Legacy of the Broken Sparrow. Lucy Taylor's case continues to serve as a haunting reminder of how kindness, though boundless, can sometimes entangle unintended dangers. For Blackthorn, the sparrow became a symbol not just of Lucy's tragic story but of fragility, resilience, and the unseen battles people carry. A mural of sparrows now decorates the elementary school Lucy once tirelessly worked at, with a plaque reading, "May we always value kindness, but also recognize when those who would twist it take flight in dark, broken ways." The Masked Murderer of Los Angeles. On Halloween night in 2018, West Hollywood glimmered under the glow of jack-o'-lanterns, costumes, and neon storefronts, as thousands of revelers flooded its famed streets. But amidst the extravagance of festivities, a sinister discovery sent chills down the spines of even the most seasoned detectives. In a grimy dumpster behind a trendy nightclub, sanitation workers found something grotesque, a pile of discarded, intricately designed Halloween masks. At first glance they seemed innocuous, creative displays of ghoulish artistry. But upon closer inspection, one worker realized something horrifying. Each mask was made with a thin layer of what appeared to be human skin. The LAPD was called in, and it didn't take long before the masks became the focal point of one of the most haunting serial killer cases in Los Angeles history: the disfigured facades. The discovery of the masks, and the human remains used to craft them, immediately shifted the festive energy of Halloween in West Hollywood into a scene of collective panic. Police cordoned off the area overnight, combing through the dumpster and the surrounding blocks for clues as parties continued unabated nearby. The masks were horrifyingly intricate, each featuring a chillingly lifelike expression of fear or despair. Upon forensic inspection, investigators realized these masks were not just horrific art, they were faces. The killer had crudely removed layers of skin from the victims' heads to create lifelike replicas, each soaked in preservative chemicals to prevent decay. Traces of makeup, fake blood, and adhesive were found on the surface, tools of a deranged mind who had mastered the art of disguise. A chilling question emerged. Were these masks worn during the very festivities in which they were discarded? LAPD detective Erica Santos, who headed the investigation, recalled, "There was something so haunting about it, not just that it was grotesque, but that people likely walked past the person wearing one of these masks and thought it was just part of the fun." A pattern hidden in shadows. As investigators scrambled to identify the victims, the masks yielded no immediate results. The killer had stripped away distinguishing features, nostrils, eyebrows, ears, making it nearly impossible to reconstruct appearances. Forensics were able to match DNA from the remaining skin tissue to 3 missing persons cases, each victim a part of Los Angeles's underground art and modeling communities. The victims all shared similarities. They were young, attractive, and frequented West Hollywood nightlife. Most were aspiring actors, artists, or dancers trying to make a name for themselves in LA's glamorous scene. However, their social circumstances made them vulnerable, for many were estranged from family, juggling day jobs to make ends meet, and living on the edge of stability. Detectives soon uncovered that each of the identified victims had vanished after attending private casting calls organized through online advertisements. These events, promising opportunities for modeling gigs or artistic collaborations, were held at vague locations like warehouses, small studios, or abandoned lots. An ominous connection pointed toward the elusive organizer, who circulated these ads under the pseudonym Mask Maker. These people were ambitious. They were willing to risk everything to break into the industry, an anonymous source close to one of the victims shared. And someone like Mask Maker knew exactly how to exploit that desperation. The deranged artist behind the masks. The case broke wide open when detectives traced the Mask Maker pseudonym to Everett Cole, a 43-year-old former special effects makeup artist who had once worked on numerous low-budget horror films in the early 2000s. Known for being reclusive and eccentric, Cole was respected for his macabre artistry, but his career had plummeted after numerous allegations of unprofessional behavior. According to former colleagues, he had a fascination with creating hyper-realistic facial prosthetics, often boasting he could craft a mask that would fool even the sharpest eye. After leaving the film industry, Cole spiraled into obscurity but stayed active in Los Angeles's underground art scene, where his dark talent garnered a niche following on social media. Some posts even included bizarre photos of him wearing disfigured skin-like masks, a detail dismissed as part of his theatrics at the time. It would later prove to be far more sinister. When detectives raided his dilapidated home in an isolated part of East LA, they uncovered a chilling workshop that could only be described as a serial killer's den. Masks of all shapes and sizes hung along the walls like grotesque trophies. Scattered across work tables were jars of preservatives, makeup brushes, sharp scalpels, and fragments of partially cleaned human skin. On a blood-stained notebook scrawled in shaky handwriting were notes such as, "Perfect layer nose bridge intact, next, eyes." In the basement, investigators found his most disturbing collection, mannequins wearing full human skin suits with faces crafted from real victims. Body parts from at least 5 individuals were stuffed into freezers and plastic storage containers. Notably, these remains bore meticulous incisions, with many resembling professional autopsy techniques. A twisted philosophy. Under arrest, Cole showed no remorse. Sitting across from detectives during questioning, he spoke calmly, as if discussing an art project. According to transcripts, he referred to his killings as creations and his victims as canvases. "They wanted to be seen. I gave them that," he said, smirking. Nothing highlights the beauty of the human form quite like stripping away the complexities of life and leaving only the surface. Psychologists later diagnosed Cole with profound antisocial personality disorder and a warped worldview stemming from years of rejection and failure in the film industry. Interviews with his peers painted a picture of a deeply deranged individual who long believed his work would one day earn him immortality in the art world. One particularly chilling piece of evidence was a journal entry dated just days before his first confirmed murder. "A mask doesn't just hide who you are, it reveals what you want to be." The end of the Mask Maker. The case went to trial in what became one of the most sensational courtroom events in Los Angeles history. Dozens of former models and industry insiders gave testimony, providing critical insight into how Cole lured his victims into life-threatening situations with promises of fame. In one particularly damning moment during the trial, jurors were shown footage of Cole laughing and applying one of the human skin masks onto his own face. The prosecution argued it illustrated his utter detachment from morality, while the defense attempted to plead insanity. Ultimately, the jury convicted Cole of 8 counts of first-degree murder, including additional counts of desecration of corpses. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection, a haunting legacy. The masked murderer of Los Angeles case left a scar on Hollywood's underground culture. The community, once thriving on spontaneity and trust, became riddled with paranoia. Legitimate art shows and casting calls saw significant drops in attendance, and many aspiring creatives left the city altogether. Surviving relatives of Cole's victims fought for reforms in the modeling and casting industries, advocating for greater transparency and accountability. Yet, even as LA resumed its dizzying hustle over the years, reminders of the case lingered in whispers, urban legends, and occasional Halloween costumes eerily inspired by Cole's infamous masks. "I don't look at Halloween the same way anymore," Detective Santos admitted years later. "Every time I see a mask, I wonder, what's behind it?" The Chattanooga Highway, horror, headless bodies on I-24. It was a humid summer morning in June 2015 when the first gruesome discovery broke the eerie stillness of the Tennessee countryside. On Interstate 24, a major artery stretching through Chattanooga, a road maintenance crew stumbled upon a black trash bag thrown carelessly down an embankment near the highway. One worker, intent on cleaning up what he initially thought was illegal dumping, opened the bag, and his morning was forever changed. Inside was a severed arm, its skin pallid and its fingers frozen in a macabre curl, as if still clawing for help. Blood had long since dried, leaving a coppery stench in the thick, humid air. It wasn't trash after all, it was a human body, or at least part of one. The call to 911 that morning would not just set off one of Tennessee's most horrifying murder investigations, but also unearth a monstrous serial killer operating in the shadow of America's highways. A grim pattern on the interstate. The first dismembered body wasn't the last. Over the following weeks, more trash bags began turning up along stretches of I-24. Workers and passing motorists found horrifying pieces of human remains, arms, legs, torsos, all scattered with grim consistency. These body parts were often dumped near rest stops, gas station exits, or wooded areas just out of sight from the concrete chaos of the highway. Logistics workers and truckers, initially suspected, provided critical information instead. They noted how strange it was that the bags all resembled heavy-duty industrial trash bags, not the typical household kind. Forensic investigators later confirmed that the bodies had been dismembered with surgical precision, suggesting someone with either professional medical training or meticulous anatomical knowledge. But the most unnerving thing? None of the victims' heads were ever found. Local law enforcement, overwhelmed by such brutality, called in the FBI when the number of discovered bodies began to climb. DNA analysis connected several of the remains to missing persons across neighboring states, Georgia, Alabama, and Kentucky, but the identities of others remained a dark mystery. It was like something out of a nightmare, remembered Detective Robert Keenan of the Chattanooga PD. Not just for the mutilation, but because we had no rhyme or reason. This wasn't about rage or passion, this was clinical, cold, calculated, and terrifyingly efficient. Who was the Chattanooga highway killer? The FBI's behavioral analysis unit quickly came to one conclusion. The killer was mobile, intelligent, and methodical. He or she was no ordinary criminal. This was someone who used the vast, sprawling network of interstates to cover extraordinary amounts of ground. Someone who understood how to exploit the nooks and crannies of America's infrastructure. Moreover, the choice of location, dumping body parts along a busy highway, wasn't an accident. This killer wasn't trying very hard to hide their crimes. Instead, they wanted the remains to be discovered. Some agents speculated this was a psychological calling card, a twisted thrill from toying with authorities and the public alike. When interviewing Chattanooga locals, investigators uncovered whispers of suspicious activity at the local truck stops. Several transient individuals, long-haul truckers, drifters, and occasional squatters, frequented these areas at odd hours of the night. A handful of truckers reported encountering a weird guy, whose stories of the road seemed unnervingly specific. However, his descriptions were vague, a man in his 30s or 40s, tan complexion, medium build, and oddly charming. Every account diverged, likely because the Chattanooga highway killer blended into the background, Simply another face in a sea of people constantly on the move. Profiles of fear. The victims. By late summer, the FBI had identified 4 confirmed victims. Each of them was a drifter, people whose lifestyles kept them out of the public eye for long stretches, sometimes permanently. They were men and women ranging in age from 25 to 38. 2 were hitchhikers traveling across state lines, while another was a struggling busker playing music at roadside stops for cash. The last known victim was a woman whose profession in survival sex work placed her in the path of strangers willing to pay for anonymity. The profile that was emerging painted a chilling picture. This killer preyed on society's most vulnerable, people who wouldn't immediately be missed, whose lives lacked the safety nets of close family or stable jobs. These individuals became the perfect targets for a predator who knew how to disappear into the vastness of America's open roads. They were human beings, said Tricia Ferguson, sister of victim #3. Even if the world didn't see them, they had friends, dreams. They deserved better than to be thrown onto the side of some goddamn highway like garbage. Breakthrough. The truck cab of horrors. In September 2015, the case finally broke wide open when a state trooper conducting a routine commercial vehicle inspection stumbled on what appeared to be a bloodied tarp in the cabin of a long-haul 18-wheeler. The truck, owned by a small fleet company, was stopped near a fuel station outside Nashville. Its driver, Gary Ellison, immediately gave the officers a bad feeling. He was calm, too calm, the trooper later recounted, like he knew exactly what we were going to find but didn't seem to care. Inside the truck's sleeper compartment was a chilling discovery, a makeshift kill kit containing zip ties, duct tape, scalpels, bleach, and a pair of heavy-duty gloves. Bloodstains spattered the mattress and floor, and tucked into a hidden compartment were scraps of flesh that matched the DNA of one of the Chattanooga highway victims recovered weeks earlier. Gary Ellison, 48, was a veteran trucker with an unassuming demeanor. His co-workers described him as quiet and polite, someone who always kept to himself. Yet his criminal record revealed prior arrests for petty theft and domestic abuse in the 90s, and even a brief mention in police reports as a suspect in another interstate disappearance 6 years earlier. Under interrogation, Ellison remained eerily composed, denying his involvement. But as investigators pieced together his roots, an effort that required analyzing toll booth logs, fuel receipts, and GPS records, they realized he had driven through nearly every location where a body part or trash bag had been recovered. The end of the line. With overwhelming evidence mounting against him, Ellison eventually cracked. He confessed to murdering 6 people, all of them nobodies in his words. His motivation stemmed from what he called the piece of the road, his way of cleaning up the trash as he described it. When pressed about why he removed the heads, Ellison exhibited a chilling sense of pride mixed with a warped fantasy. "I kept them," he sneered. "The head is who we are. The rest is just meat." Investigators found the heads of 3 victims preserved in containers at Ellison's rural Tennessee homestead. Each one had been meticulously cleaned, and was stored like a warped collection in his secluded shed. The remaining heads were never recovered, and Ellison refused to say what he had done with them. Justice and lingering ghosts. Ellison's trial captivated the nation, partially due to his disturbingly candid confessions and the sheer audacity of his crimes. Dubbed the Chattanooga Highway Killer by media outlets, he was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and desecration of corpses. In 2017, Gary Ellison was sentenced to death in Tennessee, still showing little remorse. But questions about the case persisted. Ellison claimed to have killed 6 people, yet forensic experts believed the total body count could be much higher. For every victim police confirmed, there were likely others who remain unaccounted for, lost among the country's vast network of highways, rest stops, and wooded trails. Legacy of the killer. Today, the Chattanooga Highway Killer serves as a grim reminder of just how dangerous America's highways can be. The case highlighted vulnerabilities in the trucking industry and sent shockwaves through communities often overlooked by society. New regulations were proposed to track long-haul drivers and better scrutinize job applicants. Though many argue such measures came too late, the families of the victims continue to fight for their loved ones' memories, refusing to let them be dismissed as just another statistic buried in a roadside ditch. The interstates may stretch endlessly into the horizon, but for those left behind, the darkness of what happened along I-24 can never be escaped. We lock our doors at night, but nobody ever thinks about the highways we drive on, where monsters like him hide in plain sight, Detective Keenan said at the end of the trial. The Secret House in Texas. In 2016, amid the sprawling suburbs of northwest Houston, Texas, a seemingly mundane two-story house on a quiet cul-de-sac harbored a chilling secret that would strike terror into the hearts of the entire community. Beneath its pristine white facade and manicured lawn was a hidden underworld of unimaginable horror, a subterranean torture chamber where Carl Hilton, a 52-year-old recluse and former contractor, conducted a reign of terror over countless victims. What unraveled from that unassuming house would forever be remembered as one of the most depraved discoveries in American history. Escape from the underground. The unraveling of Hilton's dark exploits began with an unexpected break, an escape. After 2 years of captivity, 25-year-old Emily Harper, bruised and emaciated, stumbled barefoot onto the streets of the leafy suburb, barely able to hold herself upright. Her face was gaunt, her clothes torn and filthy, and her wrists bore the bruises of heavy restraints. Knocking frantically on a neighbor's door, Emily screamed for help, her voice raw and shaking. "He has a dungeon! He's killing people! He's still down there!" she cried out. The shocked homeowner immediately called 911. When authorities arrived at the house, Emily had fled. Carl Hilton opened the door calmly, his tall, wiry frame framed by the dim glow of the entryway. Though outwardly composed, something about his stoic demeanor and the faint, metallic scent wafting from inside sent alarm bells ringing for police. With probable cause provided by Emily's immediate claims, investigators entered the house, and what they found defied comprehension. The secret basement. At first glance, Hilton's home seemed unnervingly normal, if not a bit sterile. The living room was neatly organized, with leather recliners arranged in front of a large TV and shelves lined with books and tools. Detectives noticed several photographs of Hilton as a younger man, always alone. But as they moved toward the rear of the house, the picture-perfect setting began to crack. A door in the kitchen, tucked inconspicuously behind a pantry, led them down a narrow staircase. Law enforcement officers descended a series of creaking steps that opened into a hidden basement Hilton had constructed himself years earlier, unbeknownst to neighbors or even building inspectors. What awaited them at the bottom was a dimly lit labyrinth, a personal dungeon of horror. The basement expanded into several interconnected rooms, all soundproofed with heavy insulation. Chains and shackles hung ominously from the walls, their metallic grime reflecting the glow of a single overhead bulb. Tables scattered with tools and equipment mirrored the organized chaos of a workshop. Only this was no ordinary workspace. The surfaces were littered with pliers, saws, knives, ropes, and syringes. Cages no larger than dog crates sat in the corners, one still containing torn scraps of clothing. Emily's testimony was chilling but tragically accurate. "He'd keep us in the cages. He'd only take one of us out at a time, for whatever he wanted," she later recounted in an interview, "but most of them, they never came back." Macabre evidence unearthed. As investigators scoured the basement, their stomachs turned at each discovery. Plastic storage bins were opened to reveal dismembered remains in various stages of decomposition. Some body parts, including severed hands and torsos, were vacuum-sealed in plastic bags. Others were suspended in formaldehyde-filled jars, lined up neatly on a rack like some grotesque scientific exhibit. Hilton's attention to detail was both methodical and horrifying. A handwritten journal found in one corner detailed timestamps, dates, and descriptions of his victims, written with chilling detachment. Entries like, "Subject 13, 2 week, died after 14 days, discarded remains under crawl space," and Subject 21, "Strong resilience, testing long-term starvation," painted the picture of a man who saw human lives not as sacred, but as experiments. Further digging led authorities to Hilton's backyard, where soil disturbances beneath the shed indicated freshly disturbed graves. Using cadaver dogs, police uncovered the bodies of at least 7 more victims, some in varying states of decay, others reduced to skeletal remains. Hilton's property, in more ways than one, was a tomb. Carl Hilton, a dark history. Carl Hilton's neighbors described him as quiet but unremarkable, someone who mostly kept to himself. He was a former contractor who had built homes for years before suddenly retiring in his late 40s. Though unmarried and childless, no one questioned his solitary lifestyle. He was the kind of guy you'd wave to from your lawn. Not overly friendly, but not suspicious either, one neighbor remarked. But as authorities delved into Hilton's life, a darker portrait emerged. Growing up in rural Kansas, Hilton's father was an abusive alcoholic who would lock him in the cellar for hours as punishment. Those close to him also recalled his strange fascination with power dynamics and control, an interest he developed into adulthood. One particularly eerie anecdote surfaced from a former co-worker. He joked once during a job about building a basement so well that no one would ever find you if you disappeared. I thought it was just dark humor, but now, I can't stop thinking about that. Hilton had acquired most of his tools and equipment legally, blending his background in construction with the ghastly activities he carried out underground. His journal revealed that he had devised his secret basement over the span of 5 years, modifying his home in such a way that no one, not even his closest neighbors, suspected a thing. The victims of the dungeon. As the investigation progressed, the enormity of Hilton's crimes became evident. In total, physical evidence in Hilton's journal pointed to at least 15 confirmed victims, though authorities suspect there were more. Most of them were vulnerable individuals, missing persons who lived on the margins of society. Among those identified were runaway teens, sex workers, and even a traveling college student who had been reported missing 2 years prior. Hilton preyed on isolated and desperate people, often luring them to his house with promises of food, shelter, or safety. Once inside, escape was nearly impossible. Emily Harper, the survivor whose daring escape brought Hilton to justice, later described her years in captivity during the trial. He had this way of making you feel utterly powerless. Every second felt like a waking nightmare. I survived, but pieces of me will never come back. The trial of a monster. The trial of Carl Hilton was one of the most watched criminal cases in Texas history. Moving footage of victims' families filled the courtroom as prosecutors unveiled the horrors Hilton inflicted on his prey. Despite mountains of evidence, Hilton remained stoic throughout, rarely speaking and showing no empathy. When asked by the judge why he had committed such heinous crimes, Hilton coldly replied, "Because I could." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, convicting Hilton on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and torture. In 2018, Carl Hilton was sentenced to death by lethal injection, though no execution date has been set yet. Legacy of the Secret House. Today, the house on Willowbrook Lane stands abandoned, a grim reminder of the evil that had festered behind its doors. It has become a site of urban legend, with whispers of hauntings and people daring to step onto the property at night. Yet for the families of Hilton's victims and the survivors like Emily Harper, the scars remain far beyond the ghost stories. Hilton's case also sparked long-overdue discussions about the vulnerabilities of transient populations and the ease with which predators like him operate unnoticed. Local organizations have since stepped up efforts to aid those who are homeless or in crisis, ensuring they don't fall through the cracks of society. But for many in Houston, the question lingers: what other secrets might still hide behind the walls of seemingly normal homes? The Dry Well, in Arizona. In 2019, the blistering sun of suburban Phoenix, Arizona, cast its golden heat over neighborhoods and parks, hiding the darkness simmering beneath its bright surface. It started innocently enough, a group of children giggling and chasing one another by an old dry well near a patch of overgrown land in a local park. But their innocent play led to a chilling discovery that would unearth one of the state's most horrifying crimes. Beneath the cracked earth, inside that forsaken well, lay the remains of 3 women, tied, malnourished, and discarded like forgotten wreckage. They hadn't just died, they had endured unspeakable torture before succumbing to hunger and suffocation in their final moments. What followed was an investigation that revealed the twisted mind and hateful obsession of a man who believed himself to be a divine agent, purging those he saw as unworthy of salvation. The chilling discovery. It was a scorching afternoon in August when the voices of children drew attention to the old, abandoned well. As they leaned over its edge, hoping to find some mystery to entertain their boredom, the youngest among them cried out. The smell was thick and sour, a nauseating wave of death rising from the dry abyss. Through the cracks of sunlight streaming into the deep well, they could see shapes, something human, or what was left of them. Panicked, one child ran to the nearby home, screaming for an adult. Police arrived within the hour, cordoning off the area and carefully lowering a camera into the well to confirm the children's horrifying discovery. What the officers found at the bottom of the 30-foot deep pit haunted them. There lay 3 women, bound with rope, their skeletal remains clinging to shredded scraps of clothing. Their mouths were gagged, their wrists tied behind their backs, and their ankles bound together. Investigators immediately noticed the marks along their arms and legs, patterns of restraint burns and cuts, indicating they had struggled for days, if not weeks, before succumbing. The state of their remains suggested they had been thrown into the well while still alive. Forensic experts later confirmed that dehydration, starvation, and lack of oxygen had killed them slowly, the dry Arizona heat cooking the air inside the well like a cruel oven. The investigation, a pattern of misery. As forensic teams worked around the clock to identify the victims, the local community erupted in fear and speculation. Who were these women? How had they ended up here? And most importantly, who did this to them? The remains were so decomposed that identification proved difficult at first, but after sorting through missing persons reports and conducting DNA tests, detectives confirmed the women were locals, 2 of them missing for nearly 4 months, their disappearances seemingly overlooked. Their lives painted a tragic yet familiar story, women estranged from their families, transient in lifestyle, and struggling to survive under the harsh realities of life on society's fringe. One of the victims, identified as 29-year-old Christine Delgado, had been couch-surfing in Phoenix after fleeing an abusive relationship. Another, Maria Chavez, was battling homelessness and worked odd jobs for cash. The third victim, 24-year-old Amanda Parker, was known to frequent bars on the outskirts of the city, often seen alone. While their paths in life had been different, their eventual fates drew a sharp and horrifying connection. They had all been targeted by the same predator. The mind of a monster. The investigation soon turned to the area surrounding the well. Witnesses described a man often seen loitering in the overgrown park near the well, tall, gaunt, balding, and always muttering under his breath. It didn't take long for detectives to learn the name of their primary suspect. David Easley, a 44-year-old local handyman who lived less than a mile from the site of the discovery. Easley was known in the area for his eccentric, erratic behavior. Neighbors described him as the creepy loner down the street who spent most of his time tinkering with old rusted junk in his backyard or shouting about sinners and judgment to no one in particular. Easley, it would turn out, was a deeply troubled man. His descent into madness had been years in the making, driven by an obsessive belief that he had been chosen by God to cleanse society of immoral women. Detectives discovered Easley's handwritten journals stashed in his cluttered, garbage-filled home, rambling out incoherent yet terrifyingly specific philosophies about morality and divine justice. In one chilling entry, Easley wrote, "They are filth. They laugh at the sacred laws. The darkness in them must be purified in silence, for no one else has the courage to do what must be done." Easley's journals also hinted at a carefully planned modus operandi. He stalked vulnerable women, the homeless and the barely surviving, the runaways and the forgotten, offering them odd jobs or help, then luring them to his cleansing site at the park. Once there, he overpowered them, tied them up, and transported them to the abandoned well, lowering them in with a makeshift pulley system. His obsession wasn't just about murder, it was about watching his victims suffer, prolonging their deaths to satisfy his warped sense of divine punishment. The arrest. When police arrived at Easley's property with a warrant, what they discovered was as disturbing as the man himself. His backyard was littered with evidence, lengths of rope matching that found on the victims, a rusted pulley smeared with old blood traces, and even metal buckets filled with murky, stagnant water Easley had likely used to mock his thirsty captives. Most damning of all was a small collection of personal items, necklaces, purses, and shoes, belonging to the 3 women found in the well. Easley was arrested on the spot. He greeted officers with blank, unblinking eyes, offering no resistance and almost no words. During questioning, he denied the murders at first but gradually leaned into babbling about his righteous mission. Transcripts from his interrogation revealed the haunting details of his delusions. "They were sinners," Easley whispered, leaning forward in his chair. "God told me to cleanse them. I gave them time to repent at the bottom of the well, but they refused. They clung to their sins, and so they were judged." Justice for the victims. The trial of David Easley garnered national media attention, with courtroom seats packed and audiences glued to the gruesome details as they emerged. Survivors, women Easley had stalked but who narrowly escaped his clutches, testified against him, painting a picture of a predator whose calm demeanor disguised a deranged capability for calculated evil. Easley showed no remorse during the proceedings. When given the opportunity to explain his actions, his only words were, "They had to be saved. You wouldn't understand." The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before convicting Easley on 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death in March 2021 and remains on death row to this day. Legacy of the Dry Well. The old park in Phoenix has been closed down for good, but the memory of what was found there during that summer of 2019 lingers long after the yellow crime scene tape was torn down. An iron gate now blocks access to the dry well, though many argue it should be filled in altogether. Locals still speak of the well murders, an urban legend in the making, but the pain for the victims' families remains raw and very real. Easley's case also reignited discussions about protecting vulnerable populations, especially women living in poverty or on the streets, and the systemic failures that allowed someone like him to prey on society's most fragile members for so long. The well may be silent now, but for the families of Christine, Maria, and Amanda, the nightmare extends far beyond its depths. The Hidden Child of Boston. In 2021, the quiet suburban neighborhoods outside Boston were rocked by a mystery so horrifying that it shook the idyllic New England community to its core. It began with a dilapidated, abandoned house sitting on the fringes of the town, a place the locals had long rumored to be cursed or haunted. Kids dared one another to approach its boarded-up doors. Teenagers whispered about screams they swore they'd heard late at night. But what lay hidden within those collapsing walls wasn't a ghost. It was something far worse. When investigators finally entered the house, they uncovered evidence of a sinister crime, marking one of the most harrowing cases in Boston's modern history. What they found was the heartbreaking story of Michael Johnson, a 16-year-old boy who had vanished without a trace in 2018. Hidden from the world, Michael had lived in silent captivity for years, his captor someone he once trusted. This was not the work of a stranger, but a betrayal so personal, so incomprehensible, it almost defied belief. The missing boy. Michael Johnson wasn't the kind of teenager you'd expect to disappear without anyone noticing. Bright, cheerful, and known for being the class clown, he was beloved at school and adored by his family. Growing up in an upper-middle-class household, Michael's days were filled with sports, video games, and a passion for writing short stories. Stories that often featured heroes escaping danger and saving the day. In January 2018, 14-year-old Michael left home one afternoon to meet friends at a nearby arcade. When night fell, and he hadn't returned, his parents grew worried. By midnight they were frantic, calling his friends, his teachers, anyone who might know where he was. None of his friends had seen him after school. His phone had been turned off, and there were no clues to where he might have gone. The police launched a full-scale search. Missing person flyers covered telephone poles, social media campaigns spread like wildfire, and volunteers scoured the nearby woods. Weeks turned into months, and then into years. For his parents it was unbearable, a mix of anger, grief, and the faint and fading hope that he might somehow return. But as time passed, Michael became just another face in the growing list of Boston's unsolved cases, his disappearance joining the ranks of those that left the community shaken, but unanswered. The rumors. Even as the search for Michael waned, whispers began to circulate about a strange house on the edge of town, a dilapidated Victorian-style building on Cambridge Street that had been abandoned for at least a decade. Neighbors avoided it. Kids called it the haunted house. Its windows were shattered, the paint peeling, and dead ivy clung to its crumbling walls. Locals shared eerie stories of strange sounds, thumps, muffled cries, and the occasional flicker of light from inside. But there was never any evidence to support these tales, and it became little more than an urban legend. It wasn't until late 2021 that the rumors took a sinister turn. A group of thrill-seeking teenagers broke into the house on Halloween night. Armed with flashlights, they laughed nervously as they explored the cobwebbed ruins. But soon, their excitement turned to fear. In a room on the second floor, they found a locked door chained from the outside. When one of them pressed their ear to the wood, he swore he heard something, a faint rhythmic sound, raspy and low, like breathing. Terrified, they fled the house and contacted local authorities. Police initially dismissed it as a prank, typical of bored teens during Halloween, but after persistent calls from the community, they agreed to investigate. The House of Horror. When officers entered the house, they immediately felt a suffocating sense of dread. The interior was in complete disrepair, floors rotting, walls blackened with mold. But as they climbed to the second floor, they discovered something far more sinister. That same locked door. Breaking the chain, they opened it to reveal a small dark room. Inside was a single bed. its mattress stained with filth, surrounded by piles of discarded wrappers, empty water bottles, and broken furniture. The smell was overwhelming, an acrid stench of waste, sweat, and decay. And then their flashlights fell on something haunting, a notebook lying on the floor, its pages filled with shaky handwritten entries. "I'm still here. Day 300, I want to go home. Why won't anyone find me?" Each entry grew more fractured, more desperate, until they became little more than scribbled words trailing into madness. Officers searching the house made their way to the basement, where they discovered the ultimate horror: Michael Johnson's skeletal remains, curled in the corner of a makeshift cage made from rusted pipes and old wood. The boy who had been missing for over 3 years had spent his final days imprisoned underground in the most unimaginable misery. The mastermind. The investigation into Michael's death revealed a shocking twist. His captor wasn't a stranger or a faceless evil hiding in the shadows. It was someone Michael and his family knew well. The perpetrator was Thomas Grayson, the Johnson family's former housekeeper. Grayson had been fired in late 2017 after years of erratic and inappropriate behavior. He had developed an unhealthy obsession with the Johnson family, particularly Michael, whom he viewed with twisted affection. Grayson had grown enraged after losing his job, blaming Michael's parents for taking away his place in their home. In a chilling confession, Grayson described how he had lured Michael under the guise of needing help with a secret surprise project. He'd kidnapped the boy, locking him away in the abandoned house he had secretly used as a hideout. Grayson's intent wasn't just to imprison Michael out of revenge, it was to possess him, to create a world where only the two of them existed. "He was mine to protect," Grayson muttered during interrogation, his voice calm and detached. "His family didn't deserve him. I kept him safe from them, from the world, the fallout." The case sent shockwaves through Boston and beyond. The community that had mourned Michael's disappearance now contended with the horrifying truth that he had been alive, suffering mere miles from his family for years. Grayson was charged with kidnapping, torture, and first-degree murder. The courtroom was packed during the trial as gruesome details of Michael's captivity emerged. Testimonies from experts painted Grayson as a manipulative narcissist who had planned the crime for months, fantasizing about creating a twisted family dynamic with Michael as its centerpiece. Michael's parents' words during their victim impact statement struck at the heart of everyone present. "He was just a boy," his mother tearfully said, "and he died thinking we had forgotten him, thinking we didn't care. But we never stopped looking for you, Michael. Never." Grayson was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Legacy of the hidden child. The house on Cambridge Street, once a playground for ghost stories, became a symbol of something far darker, a reminder of the real evils that can hide behind ordinary walls. It was eventually demolished, but for years afterward, no one would walk near the property without feeling an eerie sense of loss. Michael's story sparked a broader dialogue about missing children and how cases can be mishandled or deprioritized after the initial search phase. Advocacy groups formed in his memory, pledging to ensure no child would be forgotten in similar circumstances. For Boston, the case of the hidden child serves as a harrowing reminder of the monsters we never suspect, lurking not in the night but among us, blending into the fabric of normality until their darkness reveals itself. The nameless victims of Nevada. In the scorching heat of the Nevada desert in 2020, a discovery was made that sent shockwaves across the state and gripped the nation in fear and disbelief. Over a span of 6 months, scattered among the sandy, desolate wasteland, search teams unearthed body after body. More than 10 dismembered remains were found, all expertly dissected, a grotesque spectacle of brutality and precision. What made the case even more chilling was the killer's apparent expertise. Whoever committed these crimes wasn't just another psychotic madman. Instead, it became horrifyingly clear that this was someone with a deep understanding of anatomy, someone who likely had medical or scientific training. The press dubbed the perpetrator the Nevada Butcher, while the FBI raced against the clock to catch the highly skilled murderer behind one of the most disturbing cases in recent history, the disjointed puzzle. The ghastly mystery began with a hunter's unexpected discovery in a remote stretch of desert, miles away from any known civilization. It was late February 2020, and the man had ventured into the area tracking antelope. Instead of game, he happened upon a shallow, hastily dug grave. Inside was a human torso, stripped of its limbs and head. The corpse was remarkably clean, so surgically precise that it caused confusion even among the first responders. It bore no jagged cuts or signs of savagery. Instead, the incisions were smooth and deliberate, as though someone had performed a controlled autopsy. It was clear that whoever had done this possessed exceptional anatomical expertise and likely surgical tools. Once word of the horrific discovery spread, it wasn't long before other hunters, hikers, and desert explorers began reporting similar findings. Within weeks, authorities uncovered more graves, some containing torso fragments, others with severed arms and legs, all scattered across the arid wilderness of Nevada. The sheer number of remains stunned investigators, yet not a single body was intact. Most disturbingly, none of the victims' heads were ever recovered. Despite their best efforts, forensic teams faced challenges in identifying the victims. None matched local missing person reports. Their fingerprints were either absent or burned beyond recovery, and there were no clues, no wallets, clothing, or personal belongings that could tie any of them to the world they were forcefully ripped from. "These bodies could have been lying out here a week ago or 10 years ago," one detective remarked. "In the desert, time devours everything." An unsettling suspect profile. With few clues connecting the victims to their identities, the focus shifted to the perpetrator. The FBI wasted no time in assembling a team of forensic psychologists, pathologists, and criminal experts to build a profile of the kind of person capable and willing to commit such crimes. The precision of the cuts and the careful dismemberment of the bodies suggested someone with medical expertise. The killer wasn't acting out of rage or impulse. These were calculated, cold, and deeply systematic murders. Experts hypothesized that the murderer could likely be someone with a background in medicine, perhaps even a disgraced surgeon or a failed medical student. The surgical tools used, a scalpel, rib spreaders, and even bone saws, further supported this theory. But it wasn't just the surgical precision that alarmed investigators, it was the complete erasure of the victims. Without heads, dental records were impossible to match. Without belongings or clues, there were no ties to anchor them to their former lives. It was as if these people didn't exist. "This isn't just killing," explained Professor Daniel Rockwell, a criminologist specializing in serial offender profiles. "This is obliteration. Whoever this person is, they see these victims as experiments, not people, or worse, they're erasing their humanity entirely, reducing them down to nothing but parts." A breakthrough in the sand. For months, the case stagnated, a grim patchwork of corpses with no leads and no answers. Then, in May 2020, a discovery 50 miles southeast of Las Vegas changed everything. A group of geologists, conducting seismic fieldwork in a remote area of desert known locally as the Dead Flats, stumbled upon a concealed underground bunker. The entrance was hidden beneath a layer of debris and camouflaged to blend seamlessly with the landscape. FBI teams arrived to investigate, and what they found inside was like stepping into the lair of a monstrous genius. The bunker, though crude, contained a chilling workspace, a rudimentary operating table, shelves stocked with labeled jars of human organs, blood-stained surgical tools, and medical textbooks stacked neatly beside anatomy diagrams. On one wall, dozens of Polaroid photographs were pinned, each featuring a dissected body part, grotesquely arranged under meticulous lighting. But perhaps more alarming than the tools or the photos were the notebooks. Inside, investigators found pages upon pages of clinical observations written in dense, meticulous handwriting. The killer referred to their victims as subjects, and seemed to view their murders as part of an ongoing study. Many of the notes detailed experiments in organ preservation, theories about cadaver decomposition, and jarring philosophical musings about the fragility of mankind. One horrifying note read, "The human body is a vessel. What's within it is irrelevant. What matters is how it can be unmade and understood." The killer behind the scalpel. As the FBI combed through the evidence in the bunker, the walls began closing in on a key suspect, Lucas Moreau, a 32-year-old former medical student at the University of Nevada. Moreau had been a rising star in his program 5 years prior, praised for his surgical precision and intense dedication to anatomy. But in 2015, something changed. University records revealed Moreau's rapid descent into instability, disturbing outbursts during dissection labs, an erratic obsession with using cadavers beyond their assigned purposes, and whispered rumors of missing samples from the university's specimen archives. Eventually, he was dismissed after being caught breaking into the university's morgue. Moreau disappeared from public records shortly after his expulsion, retreating into the shadows. Court records showed a debt in his name for the purchase of industrial-grade medical tools, and bank transactions linked him to Las Vegas hardware stores for materials like tarps, rope, and chemical cleaning agents. items essential to his gruesome experiments. Neighbors in the nearby area described him as a recluse who rarely left his small home. "I remember thinking something was odd about him," one neighbor said. "He was quiet, but when you passed him while walking the dog, he'd almost nod too much, like he was trying to fit in but didn't know how." In June 2020, agents tracked Moreau to a dilapidated RV in an isolated corner of the desert. As they approached, he surrendered without a fight. He simply raised his hands and said, "You're too late. It was already perfect." The trial of the Nevada butcher Moreau's trial gripped the nation, with horrifying details emerging at every turn. Prosecutors revealed that the dismembered remains of at least 15 subjects were linked to him, but the actual count, they argued, could be far greater. Moreau, unsurprisingly, showed no remorse. During his testimony, he framed his murders as an essential project. "Every subject contributed to something larger," he told the court. "I was perfecting an understanding of what we are beneath the skin." Families of the victims, who had finally been identified through fragments of DNA, wept as they shared memories of their daughters, sons, brothers, and mothers who had been erased by Moreau's psychosis. One mother, sobbing through her statement, said, "He didn't just take their lives, he took their names, their dignity, their humanity. He made them nothing." The jury deliberated for fewer than 4 hours, convicting Moreau on 15 counts of first-degree murder and desecration of human remains. A judge sentenced him to death. Legacy of the nameless victims. Though Lucas Moreau is awaiting execution, the haunting questions remain for Nevada. How many more victims might he have claimed, their bodies unrecovered in the vast, unforgiving desert? What drove a promising surgeon to become one of the most heinous killers in American history? The case of the Nevada butcher forced law enforcement to reckon with the vulnerability of society's forgotten people, those whose lives, when taken, leave only faint traces behind. Advocacy groups in Nevada have since rallied to create databases for missing persons, ensuring that no one else fits the label of nameless victim. But for those whose loved ones were claimed by Moreau's experiments, answers will never be enough. The shadows of Nevada's desert remain darker, forever haunted by the ghosts of an unthinkable evil. Apartment 13 in Chicago. In the heart of downtown Chicago in 2022, nestled between the rows of aging high-rises and shadowed alleyways, a smell began to seep from apartment #13 of a once prestigious, but now decaying residential building. Neighbors complained to the landlord for weeks about the foul, metallic odor wafting through the hallways. Some described it as the stench of rotting garbage, others as something far worse, the unmistakable stench of death. When no one saw the tenant of apartment 13 for over a month, the landlord finally made the call that would unravel one of the most horrifying discoveries in Chicago's modern history. With bolted nerves, he unlocked the door alongside responding officers, only to reveal what looked like a nightmare pulled straight from the deepest recesses of hell. Inside the dimly lit apartment were 5 women's bodies, bound and stuffed into suitcases, their faces twisted in silent terror. Each suitcase sat abandoned in scattered positions across the room, as though discarded like trash. But the horror only deepened as investigators unraveled the chilling truth about the man who rented apartment 13, and the violent, inhumane enterprise hiding behind its doors. The horrific discovery. The police entered apartment 13 expecting a welfare check, perhaps the remains of a tenant who had died alone in their home. What they walked into was a scene that seasoned detectives would later call a slaughterhouse for human despair. The smell, thick, nauseating, almost tangible, grew stronger with every step inside. Flies swarmed the darkened room, their buzzing echoing off the chipped, stained walls. Shattered furniture and piles of stained clothing littered the floor. But what truly arrested the officer's attention were the 4 suitcases piled irregularly in the middle of the room, another lying sideways against the wall near an overturned coffee table. When officers unzipped the suitcases, their discovery confirmed every neighbor's worst nightmare. Each suitcase held a lifeless body of a woman, tightly bound at the wrists and ankles, her mouth gagged with cloth. The women all appeared to have been young, trailing somewhere in their early 20s to 30s. Their bodies showed signs of prolonged abuse, bruises patterned their limbs, and defensive wounds marked their hands. Post-mortem examinations would later reveal signs of starvation, dehydration, and in some cases, suffocation. The quick investigation of the apartment revealed no identifying documents or personal belongings for the women. It was as if they, like so many others before them, had been erased. What horrified authorities most, however, was that Apartment 13 bore all the hallmarks of a prolonged and deliberate operation. This wasn't one gruesome accident, it was a methodical system of enslavement and death. The tenant, a human trafficker's facade. It didn't take long for investigators to learn the identity of the tenant behind Apartment 13. The lease was under the name of Peter Kane, a 39-year-old man born and raised in Illinois who had seemingly lived a quiet life. Kane had worked odd jobs in logistics and delivery services, blending easily into the fabric of everyday society, but a background check raised immediate red flags. Kane had multiple but minor records for petty crimes, including a charge of solicitation years earlier. Neighbors described him as reserved, almost invisible. He was the kind of person who avoided eye contact in the hallways and always carried heavy bags in and out of his apartment during the dead of night. None of them knew much about him except for the occasional uneasy feeling they got around his slumped figure and unshaven face. "He just creeped you out, you know," said one neighbor. "He kept to himself, but if you crossed paths, he'd give you this dead-eyed, blank stare like he wasn't really there." But Kane wasn't just a disturbed loner. As the investigation deepened, a darker truth emerged about his secret life. Peter Kane was a human trafficker, part of a small but insidious network operating in Chicago to recruit and exploit vulnerable young women. Promises and deceptions. The women found in Apartment 13 had all been immigrants, investigators later revealed, lured to America with false promises of work, opportunity, and a future. Kane preyed on desperation. He targeted women from impoverished countries, places like Venezuela, Ukraine, and Cambodia, offering them one-way tickets to the United States in exchange for what he called a chance to start over. But the reality that awaited them was far from the dreams they'd been promised. Once these women arrived, Kane confiscated their passports and identification, stripping away their ability to escape or report him to the authorities. Trapped by fear of deportation or death, they were enslaved. Some trafficked, others kept locked away in Apartment 13 for Kane's own dark desires. "He was a monster with a mask," explained FBI agent Sarah Dean, who led the investigation. "He appeared harmless, but Peter Kane was incredibly manipulative. He lured these women into his trap and stripped them of everything, including their humanity." The House of Pain. Further forensic investigation revealed that Kane's crimes spanned years, with no telling how many lives were destroyed in the rooms of Apartment 13. Bloodstains on the walls suggested intense struggles, while crude restraints, chains bolted to the floor under the bed, painted a picture of unspeakable captivity. Experts pieced together that Kane would often force his victims to work as domestics or sex workers for profit, all while systematically starving and abusing them. In the case of the 5 women in the suitcases, forensic timelines indicated their deaths had been staggered over several weeks. Each had likely died alone, with no one to hear their final cries for help. Chillingly, Kane appeared to have abandoned the apartment sometime shortly before the bodies were discovered, taking large amounts of cash and evidence with him. But in his rush to leave, he left behind small but crucial clues, including a burner phone hidden beneath a floorboard. The hunt for Peter Kane. With Kane now a wanted fugitive, a manhunt was launched across multiple states. Investigators followed a money trail left behind by Kane's frequent ATM withdrawals, eventually catching him on camera in a small motel outside Indiana. In July 2022, after 2 weeks of evading law enforcement, Peter Kane was apprehended by a task force during a midnight raid. When taken into custody, Kane was gaunt and pale, but eerily calm. Witnesses described him as cooperative, even smiling as agents led him away. His only words were, "It was just business." The Trial of a Predator. Peter Kane's trial became one of the most publicized cases in Chicago's recent history. As more evidence came to light, including testimony from survivors who escaped his trafficking ring, the depths of his depravity became clear. Survivors recounted their ordeals in chilling detail, describing him as both calculating and sadistic. "He told us we were nothing," one survivor said in court, "that no one cared about us, and for a long time, I believed him." Prosecutors charged Kane with multiple counts of first-degree murder, human trafficking, and false imprisonment. Across the courtroom, families of the 5 women found in the suitcases held tightly onto framed photographs of their lost daughters, sisters, and wives. Kane showed no remorse. In his statement to the court, he said, "If it hadn't been me, it would have been someone else. That's just how the world works." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Kane was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Legacy of Apartment 13. Apartment 13, now vacant, stands as a grim reminder of the horrors that unfolded behind its walls. The building has since been gutted and renovated, though many longtime residents chose to leave rather than live in the shadow of such tragedy. The case prompted an outcry from immigrant rights advocates, who pushed for stronger protections and oversight to prevent future trafficking and exploitation. But for the families of the victims, there was no solace, only the endless ache of lives stolen too soon. To this day, locals avoid the building at night. The number 13 inches has been removed from its hallway, but the haunting legend of Kane's crimes endures in whispers and newspaper archives. Apartment 13 is not just Chicago's ghost story, it's a chilling testament to the monstrous evil that sometimes hides in plain sight. The Gun Hunter in Colorado. In 2014, the expansive wilderness of Colorado, known for its serene beauty and boundless nature, became a terrifying hunting ground for one of the most calculated and elusive killers in the state's history. For months, a string of murders plagued the remote trails, hunting fields, and back roads of the Colorado Rockies. Each victim was shot point blank with a single bullet. Each killing was swift and chillingly silent. At first, the murders seemed random. A lone hiker found dead on an isolated trail, a teenage camper shot while gathering firewood, a motorist ambushed while repairing a flat tire on a deserted road. But as bodies began to pile up, investigators realized they were dealing with something far more sinister. The perpetrator wasn't just a killer, he was a predator, a cold and methodical figure who turned humans into his targets. Dubbed the Gun Hunter by the press, he would elude capture for 3 months, leaving a trail of fear and bloodshed across Colorado's rural heartlands. The first kill. The nightmare began in late April 2014, when a park ranger discovered the body of 32-year-old Jonas Carlisle in Pike National Forest. Jonas, a seasoned hiker and nature enthusiast, had been exploring a popular but remote trail near Devil's Ridge. He was found slumped against a tree, a bullet wound in his chest. There were no signs of robbery or struggle. His backpack, wallet, and phone were intact. The only clue was a shell casing, clean and without fingerprints, lying about 10 feet away from his body. Initially, investigators treated the death as an isolated incident, perhaps the result of a stray bullet from a nearby hunting party. But 2 weeks later, in another section of the same forest, the nightmare escalated. A pattern of fear. In May, 2 fishermen, father and son James and Cody Harris, were found dead on the banks of a winding river in the outskirts of Gunnison National Forest. Both men had been shot in the back, execution style. Their campsite remained untouched, their valuables unclaimed. Investigators were mystified. This was not a robbery, nor did the killings appear personal. The discovery galvanized local law enforcement, and rumors of a phantom killer stalking the wilderness began to spread. Locals called him the Silent Shot, while newspapers dubbed him the Gun Hunter. Whispers of fear circulated in the small mountain towns. Hunters stayed off the trails, hikers canceled trips, and campers abandoned weekend outings. When a 4th victim, 19-year-old Caitlin Price, was found shot near her campsite, authorities were forced to confront a terrifying realization. Colorado's vast wilderness had become a killing field, and the predator knew how to vanish into the terrain like a ghost. The Gun Hunter's M.O. By the end of June 2014, it was evident that all of the murders followed the same harrowing modus operandi. Each victim was killed with a single, precise shot, often while they were alone or isolated. The weapon was a high-caliber hunting rifle, fired with deadly accuracy. In every case, a single shell casing was found nearby, almost as if left purposefully, a signature, perhaps. There were no signs of physical altercations or warnings, no interaction between killer and victim. It was almost as though he was hunting them, the way you would stalk game, explained FBI profiler Rachel Heath. He acts like a predator in his natural habitat. He selects his target, stalks it silently, and then extinguishes it with one perfect shot. This isn't just a killing spree, this is hunting, and his prey is human. Even more chilling was the randomness of the crimes. A hiker one week, a couple fishing the next, a lone motorist fixing his car. The lack of connection between victims baffled detectives and suggested an opportunistic and territorial killer whose sole motivation was the hunt itself. A state gripped by terror. Throughout the summer of 2014, the gun hunter continued his rampage. By July, a total of 9 murders had been confirmed across various parts of Colorado, spanning hundreds of miles of wilderness. The randomness and scale of these killings caused widespread panic. Small towns near the hunting zones transformed overnight. Residents locked their doors and windows, something rarely done in areas known for their close-knit communities. Outdoor recreation in state parks plummeted, crippling local economies dependent on hikers, trail enthusiasts, and campers. Gun stores saw skyrocketing sales as people armed themselves for what felt like imminent danger. "We don't dare go out anymore," said one resident of Buena Vista, a small Colorado town near one of the murder sites. "It's like we're being hunted too." Billboards and flyers plastered the surrounding areas, advising travelers and residents to avoid remote areas or outdoor activities altogether. Yet despite the rising body count, the killer seemed untouchable. Breakthrough: the hunter becomes hunted. Everything changed in August 2014 when the killer made his first mistake. 45-year-old Karen Miller, an accomplished backpacker and ex-Marine, was hiking near the San Isabel National Forest when she was ambushed by the gun hunter. But unlike his previous victims, Karen was armed and trained. As she was fired upon, Karen ran for cover behind a boulder, drawing her own pistol. Remarkably, not only did Karen survive the ordeal, but she managed to fire back. She clipped the killer in the leg and later told authorities she saw the man limp away through the woods. He was tall, thin, wearing a camouflage jacket, she described. But it was his eyes. They looked dead, like there was nothing inside him. Karen's bravery provided the first real lead in the case. Blood from the scene was analyzed for DNA, leading investigators to uncover a match. A man named Daniel Hawthorne, 38, a former hunting guide with a troubled history. Daniel Hawthorne, the gun hunter unmasked. Hawthorne, a native of rural Montana, had relocated to Colorado after losing his hunting license for poaching and unregistered kills. Divorced and living alone in a dilapidated cabin deep in the Rockies, Hawthorne was described by former coworkers as quiet, cold, and a little too intense about killing. Upon searching his cabin, authorities uncovered chilling evidence: a collection of maps with marked kill sites, a high-powered hunting rifle matching ballistics from several crime scenes, and newspaper clippings about the murders pinned to the walls. Perhaps most disturbing was Hawthorne's personal journal, wherein he detailed his obsession with the ultimate hunt. "These people think they're safe in the wild," one entry read, "but the wild doesn't belong to them. It belongs to predators like me." Hawthorne had been living unnoticed, using his knowledge of the wilderness to evade capture. He avoided modern technology, paid in cash, and traveled solely by foot, blending into the landscape like a ghost. The final standoff. In late August 2014, after weeks of tracking and surveillance, FBI agents and local law enforcement cornered Hawthorne in a rugged canyon near Gunnison. What followed was a tense, 2-hour standoff. Armed and barricaded among the rocks, Hawthorne fired at approaching officers, injuring 2. Finally, after warning shots and tear gas failed, a sniper ended the standoff with a single fatal shot to Hawthorne's chest, the same way he had killed his victims. The aftermath. With Hawthorne's death, the state of Colorado breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the scars left behind by his killing spree ran deep. The families of the victims, notably strangers to one another, bonded over shared grief, forming support groups to process the senseless loss. Hawthorne's case also forced law enforcement and outdoor organizations to rethink safety in the wilderness. Programs were introduced to promote trail safety and encourage people to travel in groups, armed with communication devices in case of emergencies. The gun hunter's reign of terror became an infamous chapter in Colorado's history, a grim reminder that even the most beautiful landscapes can hide unspeakable danger. Legacy of the gun hunter. Today, the killing sites remain largely untouched, somber footnotes on otherwise scenic trails. And while Daniel Hawthorne is gone, the fear he sowed lingers in the minds of those who once roamed Colorado's wilderness freely. For too many, the mountains are no longer just a haven of peace, but a haunting reminder that, out in the wild, sometimes the hunter isn't an animal, it's a man. The Killer Volunteer Seattle. In 2011, the city of Seattle, known for its slightly melancholic rain, vibrant music culture, and progressive movements, was rocked by an unthinkable crime. A man celebrated for his generosity, feeding the homeless and supporting shelters, was unmasked as one of the most cunning and disturbed killers in the city's history. Under the guise of goodwill, he preyed on the very people he claimed to help, leaving behind a devastating trail of poisoned meals and shallow graves. What began as praise for his charitable acts spiraled into a tale of deceit, betrayal, and horror as authorities uncovered the truth about Matthew Shea, a 42-year-old community figure who had led a double life as a murderer. By the time the full extent of his crimes was revealed, the body count had risen to 18, and Seattle was left grappling with how such evil could hide in plain sight, veiled in kindness. The charitable mask. Matthew Shea was the type of man that many communities celebrated. A former chef turned self-proclaimed humanitarian, Shea often appeared at shelters and food kitchens around Seattle, dedicating countless hours to cooking meals for the homeless. Though he didn't work for any single organization, his face became synonymous with kindness among the city's more vulnerable populations. His specialty was a hot stew he called Matthew's Hearty Veggie Delight, a meal he claimed was crafted to be healthy, sustainable, and comforting. Volunteers admired his dedication, city officials commended his efforts, and he was even featured in a small local magazine for his unique contributions to fighting food poverty. "He just seemed so genuine," said one shelter worker. "He knew people's names, he genuinely looked like he cared, and his food was always such a hit with the folks who came in." But beneath the smiling facade of a selfless volunteer lay a dark obsession, a compulsion to control life and death that took root in Matthew Shea's carefully hidden past. A string of death trouble began to surface in early 2011 when Seattle's homeless shelters noticed a concerning pattern. Over the span of 3 months, several regulars who frequented the free meal lines began experiencing severe, sudden illnesses. Symptoms included vomiting, diarrhea, seizures, and, in extreme cases, fatalities. While many chalked it up to exposure, poor health, or pre-existing conditions common among the unhoused, one shelter nurse, Annabelle Carter, began to suspect something far more sinister. "It was too coincidental," Carter said. "You don't get 5 people suddenly collapsing right after eating, especially when their health seemed stable just the night before." Her concerns grew when toxicology reports came back for 2 of the deceased. Both showed signs of ingesting industrial-strength cleaning chemicals, not something that would naturally make its way into food unless it was done deliberately. Still, the cases were dismissed as isolated incidents until Carter went to the authorities with her growing suspicions. By mid-2011, multiple deaths had been linked to food poisoning from the same shelter meals. Patterns emerged. All the victims were regular patrons of shelters where Matthew Shea was an active volunteer. And the most alarming connection of all? Each of them had been served his signature stew shortly before their deaths. Matthew Shea's Twisted Crusade. As detectives began to dig into Shea's seemingly altruistic life, a troubling portrait began to emerge. Matthew Shea wasn't just a man trying to help the homeless, he was a man keenly aware of their vulnerabilities. Police uncovered evidence tying him to every location where the poisoned meals had been served, and surveillance footage from one shelter showed Shea lingering unnaturally close to the kitchen's cleaning supplies during meal prep. Soon, his carefully constructed public image unraveled, revealing traces of a deeply troubled history. Shea's former colleagues from his earlier career as a chef painted him as obsessive and rigid. He was fired from a high-end restaurant in 2005 after several complaints of abusive behavior and violent outbursts in the kitchen. One former co-worker described him as a control freak. You couldn't even breathe wrong without him flipping, but he hid it well whenever management was around. Psychologists studying Shea's behavior after his capture theorized that his crimes stemmed from a godlike need for control over those he viewed as lesser. In his mind, acts of charity became the ultimate power play, feeding someone, and then deciding whether they lived or died. In one chilling confession, Shea said, "Homeless people are invisible to society. No one notices when they're gone. They should be grateful for a good meal, even if it's their last." A gruesome discovery. The investigation reached its breaking point when detectives searched a small plot of land Shea owned on the outskirts of Seattle, a property he had inherited from his parents. Buried beneath the mossy soil were the decomposed remains of 12 individuals. Each body showed signs of advanced decomposition, and many had traces of the same cleaning chemicals found in earlier victims' toxicology reports. Unlike the shelter victims, these individuals had been murdered in cold blood and buried in secrecy. Police suspected that some of the bodies belonged to those who had consumed Shea's meals outside of the shelters, people he may have lured into his care with promises of food and safety. Others were never identified due to the advanced stages of decay. Inside a shed next to the burial site, investigators found journals written by Shea. In these chilling entries, he bragged about his work and detailed the twisted philosophy that had driven his murders for years. "They waste the air," one entry read. "They drain the system. All they are is flesh, and I found a way to make them useful, for experiments, for lessons, for absolution." The arrest. On November 3, 2011, authorities arrested Matthew Shea at a church soup kitchen where he was preparing another serving of his infamous stew. Witnesses later recalled his calm demeanor during the arrest, as though he knew the day would eventually come. "I was kind of relieved when they took him away," one shelter worker said. "Something about him. It just never sat right, like he was too eager to help." During interrogation, Shea alternated between silence and chilling admissions, at times expressing what investigators described as a perverse pride in his actions. "It wasn't murder," he told them. "It was mercy. They were already dead to the world. I just finished it." The trial and sentencing. Matthew Shea's trial became one of the most sensationalized events in Seattle's history. Families of victims filled the courtroom holding photographs of their lost loved ones. Survivors who had unknowingly consumed poisoned meals testified, describing the deep sense of betrayal they felt at Shea's hands. The defense attempted an insanity plea, pointing to Shea's troubled upbringing. His father had abandoned the family, and his mother, by all accounts, had been cold and abusive, alongside evidence of long-held delusions of grandeur. But the jury was unmoved. After a 6-week trial, Shea was convicted of 18 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day he remains incarcerated, reportedly offering unsolicited cooking advice to other inmates in the prison kitchen. Legacy of the killer volunteer. The case of Matthew Shea left a dark scar on Seattle's sense of trust. The shelters he once frequented struggled for months to recover from the fallout, with many unhoused individuals avoiding meals for fear of a repeat attack. But perhaps the most devastating consequence was the loss of humanity Shea's actions represented. By preying on the most vulnerable, he struck at the very heart of community trust, turning acts of charity into something to be feared. Today, Shea's name lives on as a cautionary tale, proof that evil can hide behind even the kindest of faces. The livestream villain of San Francisco. In 2023, amidst the bustling tech capital of San Francisco, a city of innovation, diversity, and creativity, a sinister figure emerged from the shadows to leverage the very tools of the modern internet to commit unthinkable crimes. Using live streaming as his stage, a man captivated and horrified audiences for months as he escalated from twisted pranks and humiliation to violent assaults and ultimately murder. Dubbed the livestream villain, his carefully planned acts of terror gained traction online, amplified by a mix of fascination and fear from viewers who failed to stop him before it was too late. By the time authorities tracked him down, his actions had cost several lives and scarred countless more. San Francisco may be a hub for technological progress, but this dark episode proved that even the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. The birth of infamy. It began quietly, almost innocently, with a series of viral prank videos uploaded to obscure corners of the internet. In late 2022, an anonymous account under the pseudonym SF_Predator began live streaming what appeared to be harmless public pranks. The stunts frequently involved startling passers-by, tricking delivery drivers into chasing down fake packages, or startling morning commuters with loud noises and fake accidents. At first, the videos received only minor attention. They blended in with the larger ecosystem of pranksters and outrageous personalities crowding platforms like TikTok, Twitch, and YouTube. But SF_Predator soon upped the ante. Over time, what began as childish antics became darker, more malicious. His pranks shifted toward causing genuine distress, in one instance live streaming as he dumped a drink on someone's head and ran away while laughing. His content quickly gained traction as clips were reposted on forums and social media. The audience's reactions fueled his efforts. Fans in comment sections begged for more extreme pranks, tyrannizing strangers for entertainment. What viewers didn't realize or didn't want to admit was that the man behind SF_Predator had a much darker agenda in mind. A turn toward cruelty. By early 2023, the tone of SF Predator's videos was unmistakably sinister. Pranks turned into deliberate acts of cruelty. In one infamous live stream, he ambushed an elderly man walking his dog, hurling insults while pushing him violently to the ground in front of thousands of live viewers. In another instance, he locked a convenience store clerk inside his shop after blocking the doors from the outside with bike chains. Perhaps the most infamous of these early videos was a segment dubbed Public Humiliation Night. during which SF_Predator live streamed himself throwing buckets of paint onto homeless individuals sleeping on San Francisco sidewalks. The backlash from local communities was swift, yet it only emboldened him. He reveled in the infamy, referencing his critics in subsequent streams, mockingly adding slogans like, "Paint the streets with laughter." What made it worse was the interaction with his audience. As many condemned him, a disturbingly large subset of viewers egged him on, giving him challenges, dares, and even monetary tips through donations. Some wrote, "More pain, less shame. Push someone into the fountain next. You're untouchable, SF_Predator." These comments became a part of the spectacle, motivating him to escalate his violent behavior. What started as public humiliation would soon escalate into murder. The first death on camera. On March 30th, 2023, everything changed. During one of his most infamous live streams, SF_Predator prowled a nearly empty San Francisco subway station late at night. The adrenaline-fueled broadcast was accompanied by hyped music and taunts to his viewers. "Give me a challenge, something wild, show me you've got guts." As comments and donations flooded in, one message stood out. "Push someone onto the tracks, bet you won't." Minutes later, the camera's shaky feed captured the horrifying moment when SF_Predator approached 27-year-old Ryan Alvarez, a software engineer heading home late from work. Without warning, the livestreamer shoved Ryan onto the subway tracks as the screech of an oncoming train echoed through the station. The screen cut to black before the audience could see what happened next, but police reports later confirmed Ryan's death on impact. What shocked the nation even more than the act itself was the response from viewers. Within hours, clips from the stream were posted across social media platforms, where debates raged in comment sections. Some were horrified and demanded immediate apprehension. Others perpetuated conspiracy theories, claiming it had been staged or justified for the sake of content. Despite heightened scrutiny, SF_Predator evaded law enforcement, deleting the video and wiping all traceable accounts soon after the crime. The monster grows bold. Over the next month, SF_Predator became more elusive, but more dangerous. He began wearing a mask during his live streams, a cheaply made, featureless white face with slanted black eyes. The chilling disguise became his trademark, a symbol of fear that haunted San Francisco. Somehow, the livestream villain always seemed one step ahead of police. Streaming through VPNs and using burner devices, he continued his reign of terror. Every week, his acts of violence grew bolder, attacking random strangers, setting fire to trash cans, and on one occasion, holding a pedestrian at knife point while forcing him to pledge servitude to his audience. For law enforcement, tracking SF_Predator was like fighting a phantom. They poured immense resources into tracing his streams, studying the timing and locations, but he remained elusive. His audience, though smaller due to growing pressure from watchdogs and platform bans, remained fiercely loyal and complicit. The fall of SF_Predator. The livestream villain's final broadcast came on June 12, 2023, titled The Grand Finale. It started with him addressing his thousands of viewers while standing on the edge of the iconic Golden Gate Bridge. "Tonight," his distorted voice snarled, "we go out in history. No more small games. Tonight I'll prove who's really in control." What followed was his most twisted operation yet. Switching between multiple cameras, viewers watched as he abducted 22-year-old Amy Wilder from a parking garage in the Marina District. Amy was bound and gagged, her face streaked with tears as SF_Predator dramatically monologued into his camera, taunting both the police and his online detractors. But this time, his plan unraveled. Unbeknownst to him, one of his own viewers, a 19-year-old college student from Oregon, had been recording, not just watching. Unable to stomach what was happening, the teenager alerted law enforcement and provided key information about the livestream, including clues from background noises and identified landmarks visible during the broadcast. Police stormed the livestream villain's hideout before he could execute his twisted finale. He was caught midstream, face still obscured by the infamous white mask, and Amy was rescued unharmed. The trial of a digital predator. The courtroom proceedings gripped the nation like few cases ever had. As prosecutors unveiled the full extent of SF Predator's crimes, the reality was more harrowing than anyone had imagined. Over a year of live broadcasts had documented at least 17 violent assaults, 5 confirmed deaths, and the torment of countless victims. The trial also brought into focus the complicity of his audience. Prosecutors highlighted how many viewers had emboldened his crimes, demonstrating how donations and comments actively shaped the trajectory of his violence. SF Predator, revealed as 35-year-old Lester Crane, a failed tech startup founder, sat smugly throughout much of the trial, showing little remorse. His defense attempted to argue that his actions were a form of social experiment, but the jury was unconvinced. After a mere 36 hours of deliberation, Lester Crane was convicted on multiple counts of aggravated assault, murder, and kidnapping, receiving life in prison without the possibility of parole. The legacy of the livestream villain. The case of the livestream villain shook not only San Francisco but the entire world. It prompted widespread conversation about the darker sides of internet culture, the glorification of cruelty, the anonymity that emboldens acts of violence, and the audience-driven nature of modern spectacle. Social media platforms faced intense scrutiny, with many accused of fostering environments where individuals like SF_Predator could thrive. New laws were passed requiring stricter monitoring of live streams and harsher penalties for incitement or complicity in online crimes. But for San Francisco, the scars remain. The city now lives with the haunting reality that its landscapes and streets became a theater for one man's reign of terror, and that the world watched.